Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and this is the fourth video in the Shame and Love series, and today I'm going to be talking to you about scapegoating. Okay, so today's video is all about scapegoating, and scapegoating fundamentally has to do with shame. So this is the fourth video in the Shame and Love series, and if you haven't seen the other videos in the Shame and Love series, that's fine. You don't have to watch those first, but if you want to check them out, I do have a playlist titled the Shame and Love series. So because scapegoating has a lot to do with shame, let me give you a quick definition of what shame is. So shame is basically the belief or the feeling that we are unworthy or unlovable or invalid in some way. So some common shame beliefs are things like there's something wrong with me, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I'm bad. So all of these things are basically shame-based beliefs. And basically what scapegoating is when people take their own feelings of shame and transfer them out onto other people. All right, so the dynamic of scapegoating has a lot to do with projection and transference. So what projection is that projection is basically where we take parts of ourselves that we've rejected, denied, and repressed, and we project those traits out onto other people. And then transference, what transference is where if I have feelings about a particular person that I don't want to acknowledge, I will then transfer that onto another person. And so basically, when we're scapegoating, what we're doing is we're projecting parts of ourselves onto others, and we are also transferring our negative feelings and our shame-based feelings about ourselves onto others. All right, so I want to give you an example of what scapegoating looks like. So let's say that there is a woman named Mimi, and Mimi has a lot of unconscious judgments, but she also believes that she's a really good person and that good people never judge people. And so it's something that she's not willing to see about herself. So whenever she has certain judgments come up internally, she just says, "Oh, well, I'm just acknowledging facts. These actually aren't judgments at all." And then let's say Mimi meets a woman named Becca, and Becca is really kind of quiet and standoffish because Becca is really, really shy. But when Mimi sees this like standoffish behavior, she starts to project her own unconscious tendency to judge onto Becca, and she starts to project the kind of shame that she feels about that unconscious tendency and transfers that onto Becca. And so she starts thinking like, oh, Becca, she thinks she's so much better than everyone else. She thinks she's so smug. She's looking down on me. And so Mimi has all of these internal judgments, and she's assuming that Becca is judging her and other people the same way that she unconsciously judges. And she ultimately thinks this without there being any solid evidence of it. And because Mimi's thinking all of these negative things about Becca and like projecting onto Becca, she starts to treat Becca rather unkindly, and she essentially makes Becca into a scapegoat. But what Mimi doesn't realize in this situation is that her feelings about Becca and the things that she's projecting onto Becca are actually parts of herself. She's just using Becca as a scapegoat to try to absolve herself and cleanse herself of her judgmental tendencies by shaming Becca for those tendencies. So that's an example that's like hypothetical. So Mimi and Becca are not real people, but there was one circumstance that happened when I was in high school, and I was hanging out with a friend of mine who lived down the street from me. And this friend had a really jealous boyfriend, but he was also cheating a lot. And one of the things that he would do is he would cheat constantly, but he was so controlling and worried that my friend was going to cheat. And so he was basically taking his tendency to cheat and projecting it onto my friend. And there was even one instance where my friend had a scientific calculator, that she had from school. And, sometimes you can get like calculator errors, and one particular calculator error said RAND, like random. And he saw that and he started to think that she had some guy named Randy's number stored in her phone and that she was going and cheating on him with some guy named Randy. And so we were all hanging out like on my front porch. It was me and my friend from down the street. And then there was a guy friend that I had over named Joe. And my friend from down the street, her boyfriend pulls up and he points to my friend Joe and he's like, "That's him, that's that Randy guy. I know you're cheating on me with him." And so what he was essentially doing is he's projecting his own tendencies to cheat and to be dishonest onto my friend, even though my friend never did cheat on him. Now, when it comes to my friend's ex-boyfriend, basically he had a lot more issues than just scapegoating. But this was also textbook scapegoating as well, because he's essentially trying to essentially put his tendencies onto her. But the whole time he's really just shadow boxing with himself. So these are just some examples of scapegoating. One of the things that I want to emphasize it is that we've all been guilty of scapegoating at some point in time. So even though the example with my friend and her boyfriend is fairly extreme, and even the one with Mimi and Becca is fairly extreme, but ultimately everybody does this in some degree. So it's important to be very vigilant about these tendencies in ourselves. All right, so let's talk about where the term scapegoating comes from. So basically in ancient Greece, in a particular town in ancient Greece, there was a ritual where basically they would get a goat and they would bring the goat into the center of town, and everybody would kind of place their negative qualities onto the goat. So let's say if I'm in that ritual, if I had greed as a quality of myself, I would put my greed onto the goat. Or if I had a tendency to get really angry all the time, I'd put my anger onto that goat. Or if I had a tendency to be dishonest, I'd put my dishonesty onto the goat. And so everyone in town would basically project and transfer all of their negative feelings about themselves and all of their negative qualities onto this goat. And then what would happen is that they would all torture and drive the goat out of town. And so basically, this goat, in the torturing, driving out, and killing of this goat, the idea was that they were going to be cleansing themselves of their own shortcomings, and that it was going to actually ensure that the town was going to essentially go forward better. They were going to be more virtuous if they could get rid of all of their qualities by projecting it onto the goat and driving the goat out. And so that goat literally becomes the scapegoat. And so basically, when we talk about scapegoating, it's all about projecting negative qualities onto someone and like punishing that person for those negative qualities that we actually have in ourselves. And this is done primarily to absolve ourselves of our own shame. So it's this idea of I can put my shame onto someone else, I can feel like I'm above my shame. But the problem is that this doesn't actually work. So when we actually scapegoat another person, we might feel temporarily like we have gotten rid of our shame because we're saying, oh, that person's bad and I'm good. But ultimately, we basically externalize our own shame, which still exists there. And then if that person listens to our scapegoating, they'll internalize that shame. So it's a little bit like the idea of like, oh, I can cure myself of the flu if I give it to someone else. Well, that's not true. It's just now we have two people that have the flu. So it's the notion of trying to cleanse our shame off on another person, when in reality, the only way to actually cleanse our shame is to face it directly and to be able to explore it to the roots. So now that we've gone over some examples of what scapegoating looks like, let's look at the two primary coping responses in relation to shame. So when we have shame, we tend to either internalize the shame to cope with it or externalize the shame to cope with it. And both of these responses are about trying to run away from shame. So it's a way of coping by running away from it as opposed to facing with it directly. So one way to avoid dealing with shame is to internalize the shame. So when we internalize the shame, we start to take the shame into ourselves, and we start criticizing ourselves and judging ourselves and trying to police ourselves to behave a certain way. And so when we internalize shame, we get the sense of, oh, I have to match up to this particular tendency. Otherwise, I'm bad and wicked and not good enough, and all these other different shame beliefs. So that's internalization of shame. Now, when it comes to externalization of shame, that's where scapegoating comes in. So instead of looking at ourselves and internalizing that shame and saying, oh gosh, I'm not good enough, how do I make myself good enough, when we go through like this kind of nitpicking of ourselves, instead of that, what we're doing is we're then saying, I'm the good one, that person's the bad one, and that person has this trait and that trait and that trait. So for example, if we have, let's say, certain judgmental qualities within ourselves that we don't want to face, so the internalization of shame would be like, oh, I'm so bad for being judgmental, I can't believe that, I need to stop being judgmental. So that's internalization of shame relative to judgment. Versus if I project that out onto another person, it might look like, well, I'm not judgmental at all, and that person's judgmental. And I can't believe that person's doing this, and I can't believe that person's doing that. So one is a kind of internal scrutiny, and the other one is a kind of external scrutiny. And both are being done to try to run away from shame. And shame is really all about feeling inferior. So when we scapegoat another person, what it does is it gives us the temporary feeling of superiority because at least I'm not as bad as that person, or at least I'm not as bad as those people. But neither internalization nor externalization of shame actually resolves the shame. The only way to resolve the shame is to face with ourselves internally and to come to love and accept those parts of ourselves that we feel ashamed of. So the only antidote to shame is self-love. Okay, so if we notice ourselves engaging in scapegoating, how do we stop doing that? Well, one thing that's quite an asset within the inner work process is to be able to notice our judgments and our aversions, because then we can start to explore them at deeper levels. Well, when it comes to refraining from scapegoating, shadow work is very helpful. And if we notice that we have certain judgments and aversions, we want to look for those qualities in ourselves. And we want to practice self acceptance and self understanding as we look for those qualities. So, the deeper we can understand why we have certain qualities that we've labeled as negative, the more likely we're going to be to accept ourselves. So, if we take the example from earlier of Mimi's judgmental nature, if she was able to recognize that, okay, judgments are coming up, and why are those judgments coming up? And maybe she would see that she's dealing with shame underneath the surface, and she is having these judgments because they make her feel temporarily better about herself. So, if she can understand the vulnerability that the negative tendencies that she's judging away are coming from, then that can be quite helpful. Or if I find myself judging people who are kind of show offy, I can look and I can say, okay, are there any elements of myself that are show offy? And if I find any elements of myself, I can then start to practice a really kind of compassionate understanding where it's like, okay, where is that show offy behavior coming from? Maybe it comes from a part of me that wants to feel important or wants to feel connected or wants to feel loved. And if I can look through the lens of self love as opposed to self judgment, then I can usually drop the tendency to scapegoat those qualities onto others. Or if I find myself reeling with anger at people who have victims mentality, I can look for the ways that I've maybe pushed away parts of myself that have been on the receiving end of negative things, and maybe that I've refrained from actually owning and connecting to because I'm afraid that I would be accused of victims mentality since I judge that so harshly. And so it's coming to understand that, oh, actually, there could be some real, genuine reasons to feel very negative about certain circumstances. And that doesn't mean that it has to do with victims mentality. So it comes about from the process of understanding where our drives come from and being able to recognize they usually come from a very human, very vulnerable kind of place. And we can also basically reverse engineer these judgments to find the parts of ourselves that we've repressed so that we can come to accept those qualities in the other person and ourselves. So oftentimes a judgment outward is a judgment inward, and a judgment inward is a judgment outward. So whenever we can drop judgments toward other people for a particular trait, we can be much kinder to ourselves about that particular trait and vice versa. Next part of this video is about how to heal from being made the scapegoat. So if we've been frequently scapegoated by our family of origin or by anyone else, we're going to have a tendency to internalize that shame. And we can even go on to externalize that shame onto others. But oftentimes we end up internalizing those feelings of shame that our family of origin put upon us, and those become sort of the inner voices of self-criticism and self-judgment. And if, for example, we had somebody who is scapegoating us in our family, ultimately what they were trying to do is to get rid of their own shame by pushing it onto us. It's, again, sort of that idea of if I give that person the flu, then I'm going to be well. And that sort of is the underlying drive of all people who engage in scapegoating. And so if you've been on the receiving end of scapegoating, I recommend looking at the traits that you've been scapegoated for and to see how you feel about those traits. So for example, if I were constantly scapegoated and called lazy and, always being made out to be somebody who's like a ne'er-do-well, I'm going to look at those qualities. I'm going to look at, let's say, the quality of laziness and say, how do I feel about that? And maybe what I I've done is I've actually polarized completely against that, and maybe I've become this really, really hard-working type A person. Or maybe I have a tendency to give up easily. So oftentimes I'll probably have pendulum swung to one side or the other if I was scapegoated for being lazy. And basically, what I want to do is I want to look at the quality of laziness and I want to see if there's any emotional charge there, and also what all sorts of meanings are attached to being lazy. It's very common for us when we're scapegoated a particular way, and let's say have a certain negative quality applied to ourselves, that we'll try to push away those qualities associated with that label. So, for example, the box of laziness. So, let's say if it's like I've been scapegoated for being lazy, I'm trying to push laziness away into the shadow. Maybe I have a big box of traits that I've labeled as lazy, but within that box, I actually have lots of positive qualities. Maybe I have the ability to care for myself and to accept myself, even if I'm not doing things or achieving. Or maybe I have the ability to rest or to play without it having to be some kind of project. And so oftentimes we can really throw the baby out with the bathwater when we are trying to get rid of certain qualities that we've been scapegoated for. And so, what we want to do is we want to find that negative quality that we've pushed away in ourselves that has that emotional charge, and we want to actually look for the diamonds in the rough. We want to look for the positive qualities within that. So, if, for example, I was called, let's say, very angry, like I was accused of being a very angry child, I want to look for the gems within the box labeled angry, labeled anger, where basically maybe I've repressed away parts of myself that are able to stand up for myself, or maybe I've repressed away the parts of myself that are very aware of my boundaries, or maybe I've repressed certain parts of myself that pertain to leadership and being able to push against the status quo. So again, we want to look at the box of the negative things that we've been called or what's been projected onto us, and we want to find the diamonds in the rough. We want to find the positive qualities. And when it's the case that we can cultivate approval for those things that we've been shamed for and scapegoated for, we can start to actually develop a better relationship to certain aspects of ourself that we've repressed away as a result of our scapegoating. And when we can cultivate approval for these qualities, our internal voice ceases to be a carbon copy of the voice of the scapegoater. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to learn about shadow work, I have a free 60-minute shadow work masterclass. You can go to shadowintegration.org/masterclass, and if you enter your email, you can access it right away. And anyway, that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.